All right, so a woman is suing the city of San Francisco after police used her DNA from a 2016 rape kit to arrest her for retail theft 5 years later. The charges were dropped when the San Francisco district attorney learned that the DNA was obtained from a database that includes samples from alleged victims of sexual assault. Her lawyer, Adante Pointer, is joining us now to talk a little bit more about this case. This is remarkable. So listen, Adante, I want to give people some sort of background because they're going to know that DNA databases have been used to solve crimes. But usually those databases are either, suspect DNA or people who have already been convicted. They're not the DNA of victims. Can you just explain the difference between like the database that was used in this case versus how DNA databases are normally used to solve crimes?
Sure. We're all familiar with, as you mentioned, DNA being used as a tool to solve crimes. But we're completely unfamiliar, and it's unheard of, at least in public, that a crime victim's DNA is stored and then used years later as a tool to investigate crimes that are completely unrelated to why the crime victim came in contact with police. And here in this situation where we have someone who's a sexual assault survivor who specifically gave up her DNA in an effort to prosecute the person that violated her and her own rights as a crime victim, to understand that the police department cataloged that DNA and then is using that DNA to be run against every crime where they have other biological evidence completely unrelated to the original sexual assault, essentially for time in perpetuity, but at least for the last 6 years, is just outrageous. This lady came to the police looking for protection, and instead her DNA was weaponized against her.
Just as an aside, was the sexual assault case solved?
The person was prosecuted, but we don't have any reason to believe that the person was actually convicted. We understand that these sexual assault cases are severely underreported and convictions are far and few in between. And this does nothing to encourage sexual assault victims to speak up, to rely upon the police, and work towards prosecuting people who commit such heinous crimes.
Mm-hmm.
Rape is already underreported, and there's a massive backlog of test kits that have been submitted. What impact could this database have on future reporting?
Well, I think that what you're seeing here is the police need to be encouraging people to come forward and work with them in order to not only report the crimes, but then ultimately put people who commit these type of crimes behind bars. I think that this is the type of activity that goes completely against encouraging people to come forward, encouraging crime and sexual assault survivors to partner with police in order to address this issue. And as you mentioned, these crimes are significantly underreported. There are statistics out there that say up to 80% of sexual assaults are not reported. This is going in the exact opposite direction that the police and our society need to be going in terms of encouraging people to come forward, prosecuting the people who do these things. And so, it's very troubling for sexual assault survivors, and frankly, it would keep them in the shadows as opposed to bringing them into the light.
The reason I asked you if the sexual assault case was solved, because I couldn't understand why would they keep her DNA if they've already prosecuted someone. You would think that the DNA would move on. And also, for a theft, did they check DNA for a theft? I thought this science was really expensive, and that's part of the reason why so many rape kits are not processed, because it's so expensive. But nonetheless, the former district attorney dropped the case against your client, saying that it was a Fourth Amendment violation. What does that say to you?
Well, that lets me know that, at least he was willing to respect our constitutional rights as it relates to our rights against illegal and unlawful searches. The problem here is that she is not alone. It wasn't as if she alone was targeted for this particular type of search. Instead, every crime victim who submitted a DNA sample to the San Francisco Police Department has had their DNA run countless number of times. And from what we understand from the crime lab's own director, this was done as a general, ongoing, regular practice. So anyone who submitted a DNA sample to the police department in furtherance of trying to prosecute someone who violated them wound up in this Google-like DNA database and were consistently having their DNA processed and ran in order to link them to any other crimes that were happening in San Francisco. And that is just outrageous. None of these victims deserve that. They weren't told that this was going on, and none of them granted consent.
All right, Adante Pointer, thank you for your perspective. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good morning.
You too. Still to come, a special